Hi, good morning, students. So the class today will be on malignancies or biliary tract. So in this class, in the next 1 hour, I hope to complete two topics. One is malignancies arising from the CBD number one, and number two is, or other more important is, malignancies that arise from the gallbladder itself. Right. So the first part I think will be dedicated to discussion on malignancies arising from the gallbladder. I know these kind of classes are a little difficult, but I'm just hoping that apart from the classes that we are holding, you are going back and reading. Now it seems you people are also busy with some sort of COVID duty, but no matter what, I think you should look at it as an opportunity that you have had the good fortune to be part of this COVID exercise that the whole country and the whole world in general is going through. So not only should you be doing what you are expected to do as a part of the COVID duty, you should also take up the primary responsibility of studying. And in my case, I'm worried about your surgical teaching. Apart from what we do, I just hope, I reiterate once again that hopefully you're going back at the end of the day, opening your books once again and seeing what exactly has been discussed, because that is the only way in which you can probably improve on your surgery teaching. And perhaps from the next week, I'll be giving you some assignments. And these assignments will be basically clinical based assignments, which hopefully will cover or duplicate for the fact that you are missing out on the clinical classes. And that apart, you will also be having some assignments which will be basically theory oriented. And when I say theory oriented assignments, these are those which are very important topics from surgery point of view. Okay, so let's begin with the topic per se. Now, when you look at the etiology of malignancies of the gallbladder, what exactly we have? They constitute about 1 to 2% of the total GI tract malignancies. Of the total GI tract malignancies, gallbladder of the CBD, gallbladder malignancies, they constitute about 1 to 2% of all the tumors which arise from the GIT. Again, when you look at the males and females, now females, we find that the incidence about 2 to 3 times more common than in males. Now, this also is in line with the fact that in the females, gallbladder stone disease itself is more common. So there may be some sort of a connection between the stones and the malignancy that they develop later on. When we looked at stones, we saw that the common age group is somewhere around 40 years of age, but we find that the gallbladder malignancy develops somewhere on the 7th to the 8th decade of life. Of course, in the Indian population, we find that the age group is much younger than this, but for all practical purposes, the figures that you need to remember is 7th to 8th decade. Now, this is what I was trying to tell you. 90% of all gallbladder malignancies are usually associated with gallstones. So now the point or the question that arises in our minds is there a connection between gallstones and the malignancy per se? Now, a lot of studies have been done to find any association between gallstones and malignancy. Association, of course, the casual association is always there. That means 90% of the GI malignancies will also be having gallstones. But when it comes to a cause and effect relationship, we find that there is no direct relationship between gallstones and malignancies. But what we have found is when the stones are much larger in size, larger than 3 centimeters, we find that the risk of cancer is perhaps much more. So what exactly happens in larger stones that is not happening in small stones? Now in small stones, we find that the fibrosis and the changes that happen in the mucosa of the gallbladder is much less as compared to the changes happening in stones which are larger. And the key figure is larger than 3 centimeters. So in stones which are larger than 3 centimeters, the kind of chronic inflammation and changes that happen in the gallbladder mucosa is perhaps much more. And that is probably the reason why we find that stones larger than 3 centimeters are associated with a 10-fold increase in the risk of cancers of the gallbladder. Now, there is another entity that is called as the polyps of the gallbladder. When you have polyps in the gallbladder, and those polyps which are larger than 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter in size, these patients also have a risk of developing malignancies of the gallbladder. So the second risk factor is polyps of the gallbladder measuring more than 1 centimeter. And of course, this is something that I had discussed with you earlier. When you have this porcelain gallbladder, in porcelain gallbladder, there is actually a rim calcification which is there in the mucosal surface. In these patients, we find that the incidence is 20%. That means 20% of all porcelain gallbladders actually end up with malignancies of the gallbladder. Now, we also find there is some sort of an association with it, anomalous pancreatobiliary duct junction. When you have the biliary system coming and you have the pancreatic system coming, they usually have a common channel, and after common channel, you actually have the ampulla vata over there, and then through the sphincter of Oddi, the emptying happens. Now, when you have anomalous junction between these two, in those situations, what actually happens is there is reflux of juice, pancreatic juice happening upwards, and there is also reflux of the bile secretions which are coming that can enter the pancreas. So this anomaly sometimes is also responsible for pancreatitis, and sometimes it is also responsible for developing certain changes in the biliary system. And we had discussed in the earlier class about choledochal cyst. So one of the reasons why choledochal cyst develops in the biliary system is because of this anomalous pancreaticobiliary duct junction. That means, in this case, an anomalous pancreaticobiliary junction is associated with malignancy. Now, pancreaticobiliary junction anomaly may or may not be associated with choledochal cyst. But we also know that the cause for choledochal cyst is primarily pancreaticobiliary duct junction anomaly. Okay, so you can have pancreaticobiliary duct junction anomaly with or without choledochal cyst, and therefore we find that presence of pancreaticobiliary duct junction anomaly as well as presence of choledochal cyst, both are actually harbingers of malignancy happening in the gallbladder. Sclerosing cholangitis is again something that we have discussed earlier. Sclerosing cholangitis, in this condition, you can have basically malignancies developing along the whole biliary tract, including in the gallbladder. Then there are also the exposure to carcinogens, which perhaps is much less now, but initially exposure to nitrosamines and azotolene, these dyes were responsible for development of malignancies. But if you ask me what are the common conditions which lead to malignancy, is number one, polyps of the gallbladder, or first let's start with stones in the gallbladder, because that's an association. Perhaps larger stones may be having some deeper associations. We can say large stones where there is tenfold rise. Then you have the polyps of the gallbladder, calcification of the gallbladder, that is porcelain gallbladder, anomalous pancreaticobiliary duct junction, choledochal cyst, sclerosing cholangitis, and exposure to certain dyes like nitrosamines and azotolene. Now, when you look at the pathology, I think I can safely take my mask off because there's nobody except me in this room. Speaking becomes a little difficult with the mask on. Okay, there you are. So when you talk about the pathology, we find that adenocarcinomas are by far the commonest type of malignancy that you find in the gallbladder. They are anywhere between 80 to 90% of all the tumors end up being adenocarcinomas. And within the adenocarcinoma, this is not very important, but if you can, you please note down and try to remember. We have the papillary type, the nodular and the tubular type, of which the papillary variety is perhaps more common. So number one, you need to remember is adenocarcinomas constitute about 80 to 90% of all the malignancies, of which the papillary variant is perhaps more common. The rest, 10 to 20% of the tumors could either be a squamous cell carcinoma, a adenosquamous, or a wart cell carcinoma. Now, cancers of the gallbladder, how do they spread to the local areas? The first mechanism of spread is by direct invasion. It directly invades into the liver parenchyma, that is segment 5, where the gallbladder bed is usually situated. Then it also has lymphatic spread, it has venous drainage, and more importantly, it also has something which we call as peritoneal seeding. Now, what are the clinical manifestations of malignancies in the gallbladder? Many a times, the patient could be complaining just of abdominal discomfort. Apart from abdominal discomfort, patient may also be complaining of a very definitive pain which is located in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen. Patient can also have accompanying nausea and vomiting. In malignancy, which are a little more advanced and has now involved probably the biliary tract in the region of the common hepatic duct, you will find that the patient may also be having jaundice. Then there can also be weight loss, there's anorexia, there's ascites, and of course, many a times when the lesion is quite large, you can feel an abdominal mass. So the presence or basically the malignancy of the gallbladder, they have very innocuous presentation in the early stages, but once jaundice develops, weight loss is happening, anorexia, ascites, and abdominal mass per se has developed, usually the lesions are quite advanced. Now, when you need to diagnose, how do you end up diagnosing? Now, many a times, even before I go into the discussion of diagnosis, many a times it's an intra-operative or a post-op diagnosis. So what I mean by that is, we have operated for a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. We have done a laparoscopic cholecystectomy for presumable stones in the gallbladder. Somebody has not seen properly in the ultrasound that there was some thickening of the gallbladder wall or the gallbladder thickening was missed. So what happens is we just do the simple cholecystectomy, and sometimes even we surgeons, because we do it laparoscopically, we are not really palpating and seeing what exactly we are removing. Now, after we have sent the specimen for histopathology, the histopathology people give us a report saying that there is early gallbladder malignancy. Now, that is one of the commonest mode of detection of early gallbladder malignancies. What I have listed here is basically the modality with which we detect those cases which have become symptomatic. So, as I have mentioned in the biliary system, ultrasonography is still one of the most commonly employed means of diagnosis. So, by ultrasound, you can understand what is how much it is involving the local tissues, and also how much it is extending into the tissues, the vital structures in the vicinity. Therefore, we can also grade the operability on that particular lesion, whether it's an operable lesion or it's not an operable lesion. Now, CT scan does more or less what the ultrasound does, perhaps in a little better manner, because like we said, ultrasound is operator dependent, whereas CT scan is not really operator dependent. So what ultrasonography does, CT scan does it a little better. MRCP is something that has found a lot of application in the biliary tract, and the anatomical definition on the MRCP is perhaps much superior as compared to what we get on CT. So MRCP is also commonly employed, and it does the same thing. Local operability and basically in the vicinity, what all structures have been involved and not involved, those information we can get on MRCP. Now, mind you, when you do CT scan, I'm talking about CT scan of the hepatobiliary area. You can also do CT scan of a different area like the rest of the abdomen, or you can do for the chest. In that case, you will get more information vis-a-vis how much distant metastasis may or may not have happened. But initially, the focus is always on the local area to see how advanced or how early the lesion may be. Once we find that the lesion is a little more advanced, in that case, we do this particular scan, which is very, very important in malignancies. And in oncology, PET scan has a huge role to play, and that role is basically detection of metastasis. So, in terms of malignancy, whenever you get a choice, PET scan and others, perhaps PET scan may be the right answer as far as detection of metastasis is concerned. Now, having detected all these, yes, we have got enough presumptive evidence saying that yes, we are dealing with malignancy, which is perhaps confined to the local area and there's no metastasis once we have done the CT scan, or sometimes some CT scan, or more often if you have the PET scan, we do the PET scan. Now comes the part of getting a FNAC or a biopsy from that area, because unless you have a biopsy with you, you cannot embark on a major operation like removal of part of the liver, without having a definitive diagnosis in mind. So therefore, establishment of a histopathological diagnosis becomes very important because we are going to do a major dissection as a part of curative treatment. So usually, you ultrasound guided FNAC or sometimes even a CT guided FNAC more often than not gives us the diagnosis. Now, as far as core renal biopsy is concerned, we are not really concerned of doing a core renal biopsy because one of the issues with core renal biopsy is the amount of peritoneal seeding that happens is quite high. Whereas FNAC, the amount of seeding that may happen is actually much less. So FNAC is the preferred modality of establishing a histopathological diagnosis. These are just of some of the images of how the CA gallbladder looks. Okay. Again, this is a CT scan. CT scan showing this is the area. This is actually the gallbladder per se, and within the gallbladder you can see there is a mass that is occupying the lumen on the gallbladder, and here you find that the gallbladder wall is rather indistinct. That means it probably has spread from the gallbladder into the liver bed, that is a segment 5. This is the kind of pictures that you will see on CT scan. Now, staging of gallbladder malignancy is not very important for you, but as far as the T staging, N staging, and M staging is concerned, I think we should talk about it. I think in my next slide, it's better made out. Yeah. This is a slide you are probably familiar with. Now, when we say in a T1 is divided into T1A and T1B. Now, T1 basically means involvement of the lamina propria or involvement of the muscularis propria. When I say muscularis propria, it is basically the muscular layer. And like I have discussed earlier with you, there is no submucosa in this. Otherwise, usually you'll find in the submucosal plane, that is where most of the blood vessels, the arteries and the veins, they'll be going through the submucosal area. So T1A basically means involvement of the lamina propria. 1B basically means it has gone into the muscular layer. And since we do not have a submucosal layer here, T2 basically means involvement of the perimuscular connective tissue. That means this is the muscle. Around the muscle, you have these connective tissues. These connective tissues are actually involved. Okay, it involves the perimuscular connective tissue. The perimuscular connective tissue, but it has not gone beyond the serosa. It has not gone beyond the serosa. In T3, what happens is it has gone through the serosa. In T3, it has gone through the serosa, and in T4, here it shows it has the serosal layer, it has gone beyond the serosal layer. In T4, basically multiple organs may or may not be involved. So I'll just go back to what are the organs usually involved. Especially, there is a little confusion between what is T3 and T4. In simple terms, T3 is when it has perforated the serosa, and T4 when it is involving multiple organs. But in T3, there is also involvement of one or more adjacent, usually not more. It usually involves at least one organ and not more than one organ in the vicinity, or it has invaded into the liver. So there are three parts to it. One, it has perforated through the serosa, it has invaded into the liver, or it has involved one adjacent organ. So we'll see what are these adjacent organs. These are basically for you to understand rather than remember, because I don't think you will be getting a question, a long question on gallbladder malignancy. Okay, we go to T3. So T3 basically, tumor perforates the serosa. Okay, so that part we are clear. And then it has involved the liver. That part also we are clear. And it involves at least one other adjacent organ. So what are these adjacent organs? It could either be stomach, it could be duodenum, it could be colon, it could be pancreas, it could be omentum, or other extrahepatic bile ducts. Initially, when I told you about the presentation, it can present as jaundice. Once the growth usually involves the extrahepatic biliary duct, that means probably jaundice is likely to develop when it involves extrahepatic bile duct, and that is a time we also know indirectly that perhaps this will be at least a T3 lesion. Okay, so I hope I'm clear about this. So the adjacent organs are extrahepatic biliary duct, the omentum, the pancreas, the colon, the hepatic flexure of the colon, the duodenum, which is there in the closed vicinity, and the stomach. And in T4, the tumor invades main portal vein or hepatic artery. The tumor has gone way beyond these and has involved the portal vein or the hepatic artery. Now, portal vein and hepatic artery are important because once portal vein and hepatic artery are involved, it is almost impossible to do a curative resection, because if you intend to do a curative resection, you will have to do a huge amount of reconstruction. Okay, so that is T3 and that is T4. So T4 is basically involvement of the main portal vein or the main hepatic artery. And the other thing apart from portal vein and hepatic artery is in T3 we found that it involves at least or only one adjacent organ, like it could be involving either the pancreas, the omentum, or the extrahepatic bile duct, or the duodenum, or the colon, or the stomach. In this case, more than 2 extrahepatic organs. That means you can have involvement of the duodenum and the stomach, and that will make it T4. You can have involvement of the stomach and colon, that will make it T4. You can have involvement of the stomach and the pancreas, that will make it T4. So basically, there's a slight difference in T3 and T4, but one thing is common amongst T3 and T4 is by the time a lesion is T3 or T4, the prognosis is usually poor. Now you have in the nodal spread, you have N1 and N2. N1 basically is nodes along the cystic duct, the common bile duct, the hepatic artery, or the portal vein. So the nodes are cystic duct, common bile duct, hepatic artery, and the portal vein. Now N2, what is N2? N2 is basically involvement of the para-aortic nodes. The para-aortic nodes can be pre-aortic or can be pre-caval. And that apart, there is also, apart from the para-aortic nodes, there can be involvement of the superior mesenteric or the celiac axis nodes. So N2 is a much advanced nodal involvement. So by the time you have N2, actually, you can be less assured that even if you try to do a curative resection may not be possible. Now, M1 is basically distant metastasis, like metastasis which has happened, let's say, to some of the other visceras apart from the ones which are there in the immediate vicinity. Okay, so this is something that is not really important for you. In fact, the AJCC staging itself is not really important for you or necessary for you, but nobody stops the MCQ people from making difficult MCQs. That is where this knowledge is going to be of great importance to you. Last but not the least, when we are talking about the staging, the histological grade of the tumor. This grade, the information on the grade of the tumor, we are able to get only after we have dissected and operated the case. So we have G1 is well differentiated, G2 is moderately well differentiated, G3 is poorly differentiated, and G4 is undifferentiated. We find that apart from the actual TNM staging, the histological grade of the tumor also has a huge impact on the ultimate survival of the patient. A well-differentiated tumor behaves in a much benign fashion as compared to a G4 or an undifferentiated tumor. That is the message I want to convey. So now what about the treatment? Now the treatment, you just need to remember simple cholecystectomy, radical cholecystectomy, which is also known as extended cholecystectomy. So simple cholecystectomy, radical or extended cholecystectomy, and cholecystectomy combined with liver resection and regional lymphadenectomy. That means in regional lymphadenectomy, you'll be taking out all the nodes which are there in the vicinity, that is nodes along the portal vein, along the hepatic artery, along the cystic duct, among the then around the CBD and the hepatobiliary system in that area. Whatever nodes are there, you take out all the regional lymph nodes. That is a more demanding surgery. So the surgical treatment could be as simple as a simple cholecystectomy, radical cholecystectomy or extended cholecystectomy, or usually a combination of radical cholecystectomy along with liver resection and regional lymphadenectomy. Now, as far as radiotherapy is concerned, radiotherapy has some role, but the role of radiotherapy is not as well defined as the role of surgery. Usually, we find that in stage, it's a T1B. 1B means it has gone into the muscular layer. That stage onwards, irrespective of the nodal status, usually there would be a role for radiotherapy. Now, as far as radiotherapy is concerned, radiotherapy can be usually it's given as an adjuvant mode, or if the lesion is inoperable, we usually give it as a palliative mode. Now, I just want, when we discuss about simple cholecystectomy, where do you do simple cholecystectomy? Now, I told you one of the commonest mode of detection of malignancy is when the histopathologist tells us that there is a, the specimen that we sent has actually shown gallbladder malignancy. Now, when they do the histopathology and they find it is basically a malignancy of the gallbladder, they do sections and they try to see how far the lesion has actually gone. Now, if the lesion has gone only up to the lamina propria, that means it is T1A. So, T1A, if the lesion is T1A, the simple cholecystectomy that we have done, be it laparoscopically or be it open, that itself suffices as far as surgical treatment is concerned, and the patient does not require any radiotherapy or chemotherapy. However, if we find that it is the tumor is T1B, the one which we have removed is T1B, then we have the option of reoperating that patient and doing what you call as a radical cholecystectomy. In radical cholecystectomy or extended cholecystectomy, what we basically do is we take out a 1 centimeter rim of the liver tissue. That is radical cholecystectomy. So, if it is up to 1A, a simple cholecystectomy. If it is T1B onwards, we need a radical cholecystectomy. Depend on whether or not N1 nodes, if they are involved, that means cystic duct, biliary, cystic duct, nodes around the CBD, nodes around the hepatic artery, and nodes around the portal vein. If they are involved, we go one lymph node station beyond that area and remove all the lymph nodes. And that is exactly what is the premise as far as surgery is concerned. This is not really important. So when you look at the ultimate prognosis of gallbladder malignancies, we find that the 5-year survival, the overall 5-year survival in patients is less than 5%. That means less than 5 of the 100 patients which we follow up for 5 years, less than 5 of them survive. The median survival in all these patients is usually only 6 months. That means the prognosis is very, very dismal. We also find that the median survival for patients with distance metastasis at the time of presentation is less than 6 months. And when we talked about less than 6 months, this is the overall survival, whether it is an early stage or a late stage. But those with distant metastasis, we find that their survival is just about 1 to 3 months. So basically, all these facts and figures are just to tell you that the disease is having a very, very poor prognosis. So the key thing is, if you detect the disease early and you treat it, that means if it is a T1A stage where you have done a cholecystectomy or T1B where you have done a radical cholecystectomy, we find that the 5-year rate is very, very good. It's anywhere within the range of 85 to 100%, which is very good. That means early disease has a relatively good prognosis, whereas late diseases have a poor prognosis. So that is the message that you get from this slide. Okay. So we go to the next malignancy, that is cholangiocarcinoma. Now, cholangiocarcinoma arises from the biliary epithelium, the bile duct epithelium. This is a rather rare tumor. It may occur anywhere along the biliary tree. About 2/3 are located at the hepatic bifurcation, and these tumors, because of the location in the hepatic bifurcation, are known as clad skin tumor. Clad skin tumor. Now, the male to female ratio is just a little. Now, so far we have been finding that the females are the ones who suffer more from gallbladder disease, but cholangiocarcinoma is one area where the males have a slightly higher preponderance. Roughly, you can say 1.5 times more. The average population at presentation is quite similar to what we had discussed, or rather the other one, gallbladder malignancy is 70 to 80 years. Here it is 50 to 70 years. Now, what are the etiological factors that are responsible for this? Number one, you need to know that ulcerative colitis has a very high association with cholangiocarcinomas. Sclerosing cholangitis, not only gallbladder malignancy, it can also lead to malignancy in the biliary tree. Polyductal cyst, not only gallbladder malignancy, it can also lead to malignancy in the rest of the biliary tree. So you can have a cholangiocarcinoma. Hepatolithiasis is basically presence of stones within the biliary system in the intrahepatic biliary system. That is called hepatolithiasis. Phlenorrhea sinensis is another basically etiological agent where malignancy develops. Then you have a benign condition called papillomatosis of the gallbladder. In papillomatosis, there is a high chances of malignancy developing later on. You also have this. Now, these three are less frequently associated, but exposure to thorotrast is actually one of the radiological agents which we used to use, which you don't use perhaps anymore now. So, thorostrat exposure. If you're a typhoid carrier, you carry it in the gallbladder and the biliary system. So, they also are known to have. There is also some associated polycystic disease of the kidney. But the one on your left, ulcerative colitis, sclerosing cholangitis, polyductal cyst, hepatolithiasis, liver fluke, and papillomatosis of the gallbladder, of the biliary duct, these are the important association with malignancies in the CVD. Here we find that 95% of the tumors which arise here are basically adenocarcinomas. Okay. Now, they are divided into, the distal 1/3, proximal 1/3, and the perihilar. So, perihilar or the Klatskin is in the top, then you have the proximal part of the CVD, and then you have the distal part of the CVD. They are divided into three zones. So, the perihilar is one area which is quite interesting, and therefore, because it is really interesting, more often than not, you get short notes on Klatskin tumors. The intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas are treated like hepatitis. So that means the biliary duct system is there intrahepatic as well as extrahepatic. In hepatolithiasis, you can get intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas, and there the treatment is more or less like a hepatocellular carcinoma, where hepatectomy is the main treatment modality. We find that in this classification, distal, proximal, and perihilar, about 60%, not 2/3, about 60% of the cholangiocarcinomas are actually perihilar in their location. Not 2/3, but 60% of the cholangiocarcinomas are perihilar or Klatskin variety. Yeah. Perihilar cholangiocarcinomas, also known as Klatskin tumors, are further classified based on the anatomical location by two persons, that's Bismuth and Corlett. So, Bismuth-Corlett classification. So, Klatskin tumor classification is based on this Bismuth-Corlett classification, and we'll be discussing very briefly exactly what it is. So, Bismuth-Corlett classification is you have type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Type 1 is basically where it is. See, let me see if I think I have the diagram. Yeah. So, in type 1, you have, see, this is the right hepatic duct, left hepatic duct, common hepatic duct, cystic duct, and this is the common bile duct. So you have this involvement. So this is basically the perihilar variety, which constitutes about 60% of all the adenocarcinomas, right? So here you have basically the involvement is only of the common hepatic duct. It has not gone into the right or into the left. So that is type 1. In type 2, what happens is the same tumor, when it goes into the right or to the left, it becomes a type C. Here, what is happening is basically this conference that is there, this is still free. But here, what you see is this conference that is there is totally obstructed. So that only happens when this grows further and it abuts into this area. So in type 2, basically, the difference between type 1 and type 2 is in type 1 it is confined only to the common hepatic duct and the conference is free. Here the conference is also involved. In type 3, basically it goes either into the right or into the left hepatic duct. So here you see when it goes into the right hepatic duct, So here basically whole of common hepatic duct is gone, conference is gone, and it has also gone into the right hepatic duct. So when it goes to the right hepatic duct is type 3A, when it goes to the left hepatic duct it's called type 3B. And in type 4 what happens? The tumor goes both into the right as well as into the left. So that is the basis of bismuth correlate classification of flat skin tumors. Now, as far as presentation of CBD lesions are concerned, there's a presentation very classic. You have progressive painless jaundice. Progressive painless jaundice. Patient, obviously, because of the obstructive variety of jaundice which develops quite early in this case, patient has intense pruritus, itching and scratch marks all over the body. Patient may have mild upper quadrant pain. Now, what does pain signify? Pain signifies one thing. If the painless jaundice has now become painful jaundice, it usually indicates that the lesion has become much more advanced. And perhaps it may not be a condition where you can do a curative operation. And patient develops anorexia, fatigue, weight loss. So these are basically features of advanced malignancy. Whereas painless progressive jaundice along with pruritus, at that stage if you detect a malignancy, it may still be operable and you can have a good prognostic outcome. Whereas if the patient has developed pain, there is anorexia, there is fatigue, there is weight loss, perhaps the lesion is quite advanced. And even if you do a curative resection, if you can, the prognosis may not be as good as if you had detected when the patient was having painless jaundice and pruritus only. Now, cholangitis, once you have an obstructed biliary system, what happens is it's a matter of time before some infection of the obstructed biliary system happens. And when that happens, this is one of the reasons why patient can have pain. Because in cholangitis, you have the typical Charcot's triad, right? Of which pain along with fever and chills is a prominent finding. So that's what happens in cholangitis. So cholangitis doesn't necessarily mean it's an early lesion or a late lesion. And when we do investigations, we find that typically the alkaline phosphatase is grossly raised and the gamma glutamyl transferase is also raised. So this is part of the investigation. But as far as presentation is concerned, we have painless jaundice, pruritus. Once you have upper quadrant pain, anorexia, fatigue, weight loss, it usually means advanced lesion. Cholangitis doesn't necessarily mean early or a late lesion. Sometimes when we do investigations for some other unrelated cause, we find that in this jaundice patient, alkaline phosphatase and GGT levels are very high. And these usually mean, if you investigate the patient properly, you may end up finding that the patient is having a bile duct malignancy. So for diagnosis, the number one investigation or the first investigation that is done is usually ultrasound of the abdomen. Then that is followed by a CT scan, and in some centers they start with the CT scan itself. Cholangioscopy we will not discuss right now, but there are certain situations where cholangioscopy does have a role. Or for that matter, you have this PTC, percutaneous transhepatic cholangiography. So when we talk about cholangiography, let's talk about percutaneous transhepatic cholangiography. In percutaneous transhepatic cholangiography, the main important factor in determining whether or not this tumor is resectable. Now, ERCP is not very frequently done, but sometimes we need to do an ERCP because we need to take brush cytology from that area to establish the diagnosis, the histological diagnosis of bile duct tumor. So in that sense, ERCP is important. Otherwise, ERCP is not something to be used indiscriminately for diagnostic method because of the certain inherent complications, which are namely, first is it can cause bleeding, it can cause pancreatitis, and it can cause cholangitis. So these are the three important reasons why we don't embark on doing a ERCP only on a diagnostic modality. But whereas if it has some very important role like giving us information whether we are dealing with a malignant or a benign tumor, in that case, yes, ERCP would be important. Again, because the bile duct malignancies arise in a very tight area. So what happens is we need to have a lot of information about the vascular involvement. And the involvement of these vascular structures are also going to determine what kind of surgery we can or we cannot do. So, doing a celiac angiography, celiac axis, celiac axis angiography is actually very important to know which are the vessels involved and which vessels are not. Therefore, whether it is really a resectable lesion or an irresectable lesion. Or if we have to resect, can we resect and do some construction or reconstruction of the vessels in that area. That information, that very important information you will get by doing a celiac angiography. So here, the two investigations which are very important in determining resectability are number one is percutaneous transhepatic angiography and celiac angiography. MRI has the potential of evaluating the biliary anatomy, lymph nodes. So basically, MRI, like I have earlier discussed also, gives you a better delineation and information with respect to the tumor and the locoregional status. So these are the investigations that we do. Once again, ultrasound, CT scan, PTC, ERCP to get what we call as brush cytology to establish a diagnosis of bile duct tumor. Then celiac angiography to know whether it's resectable or not. MRI is, if you have it, you can do, but without MRI also you can probably go ahead and do as long as you have done all the other investigations which I have talked about. Now this is ERCP. So when we do a ERCP here, this when you put a dye there, you find that this is the area where the tumor is arising from. So what we do is we put something like a bottle brush, a much longer and a smaller version of a bottle brush that's we put in here, and we make multiple passes into this area. By doing that, what happens is the bristles of the brush will have some amount of cells from the tumor, and that is taken out and sent for histopathology, and that is how we get the diagnosis of a bile duct carcinoma. This is basically I'll just show you what we are seeing. This is the right hepatic duct, and you have this basically the sectoral ducts. Then you have the left hepatic duct. You see here the confluence you cannot really see. And what you also see is this is the part of the CPD which has kind of reformed. Reform basically in MRCP, what you find that anything that is having fluid that appears a little whitish. So here, obviously, because the system is obstructed, not much of fluid is there in the biliary system. Therefore, the lower part of the CPD is not well made out. But what you can make out from here is the common hepatic duct part is not there, and it appears to have gone both into the left and the right. But one thing we can say for sure, it is definitely involving the whole of the common hepatic duct, and also the confluence is missing here. So minimum this is type 2. Type 2 when the confluence also gone. If you look closely, perhaps you need to see more of the pictures, then you'll be able to make out whether it has gone into the left and the right. Perhaps by the look of it, to me it looks like it is probably a T4 where it has gone both into the right and to the left. So what is the treatment? The treatment, surgical excision is the only potential curative treatment. So basically, like in other case that we discussed, in the case of gallbladder malignancy also, surgery is the main goal. By doing the surgery in early stages, you do a radical cholecystectomy or a simple cholecystectomy in a T1 or a T2 lesion, you find that the prognosis is as good as 5-year survival is somewhere in the range of 85 to 100%. Whereas once the lesion is advanced and you have distant metastasis, in that case we find that the survival is median survival just about 3 months. That is the case of gallbladder malignancy. Here also we find that the same dictum is quite true. Number one, surgical excision is the only potential curative treatment. And here also, if you find the lesion and operate it early, perhaps you have a good outcome. If you operate it much late, then the prognosis is very poor. Location and local extension of tumor dictates the extent of resection. Yes, like I told you, the anatomy in the area where the biliary system is a very tight area. So, and that's the reason why we need to do a PTC, we need to do a ERCP to establish the tissue diagnosis, and we also do the celiac angiography. So, Location and the extension of the tumor ultimately dictates the extent of resection. Now, the type 1, I'm talking about basically the perihilar, that is the Klatskin type of tumor. In Klatskin, bismuth 1 and bismuth 2. In bismuth 1, you have only involvement of the common hepatic duct. In type 2, it goes a little further up and the whole confluence is also obstructed, but it is not going into the right or into the left. So in type 1 and type 2, with no signs of any vascular involvement, that means we need to do a celiac angiography to know whether vascular involvement is there or not. If there's no vascular involvement, local tumor excision with portal lymphadenectomy. Portal lymphadenectomy basically local lymph or regional lymphadenectomy. Of course, along with that, you will do a cholecystectomy, a removal of the common bile duct, and also, so once you have done this local resection of the tumor, that means you have taken out the part of the common hepatic duct. Along with that part of the common hepatic duct, you take out the gallbladder, you also take out the CVD, then you suture the lower part of the CVD there, this part is taken out, and the proximal part of the biliary system that is there, to that you bring a room-wide loop of jejunum, and to that you make an anastomosis between the roux loop and the proximal part of the biliary system. That is called as a roux-wide hepatojejunostomy. So doing this usually suffices. Now once it has gone into the right or into the left bile duct, in that case we may have to do a right or a left hepatectomy apart from what we are doing. So once we have done the hepatectomy, that may actually help the patient to some extent, but once it is a little more advanced lesion, not only is the surgery different, the outcome also is rather poor. Now, when you have initially I told you in the classification of the CVD tumors, the CVD tumors can be distal, it can be proximal, or it can be the hepatic or hilar variety. So distal bile duct tumors, in this, the surgery usually which is recommended is to do what is called as the Whipple's procedure. As far as what is Whipple's procedure, we will be discussing about it later on in a little more detail when we discuss about pancreatic malignancies. Once you have a bile duct tumor, irrespective of the location, as long as it is not resectable, usually you will try to do some sort of a bypass. And that bypass surgery basically means trying to establish between the obstructed part of the CVD and the GIT tract without actually removing the tumor in between. That is called as a bypass. So we try to do a Roux-en-Y hepatojejunostomy. Sometimes when that is not possible, we may also do a cholecystectomy and gastrojejunectomy. Basically, as far as unresectable tumors are there, the only option is to try and do a bilioenteric bypass. And the common manner in which we do the bilioenteric bypass is to use a roux loop of jejunum, and that is called as a Roux-en-Y hepatojejunostomy. I think this picture I have shown you before also what exactly the Roux-en-Y hepatojejunostomy. So the other situation, so unresectable tumors, you try to do a surgical bypass. If not a surgical bypass, you have other options also of trying to, at ERCP, you try to put a stent, and you may add chemotherapy and radiotherapy, but these things are not very, very effective. If you're using chemo, usually the agents that are used, you need to remember this. It's most important the gemcitabine, which now we are finding it to be more useful as compared to 5-FU, which was initially used. So you have the option of doing a surgical bypass. If surgical bypass not possible, you put a stent across at ERCP, and over and above that you add chemotherapy, and that chemotherapy usually a gemcitabine based chemotherapy. Here also you see the survival is very, very poor. So you don't bother about trying to remember the facts and figures here. Just remember, as far as CVD tumors are considered, as far as gallbladder tumors are considered, in advanced lesions, once they are inoperable, the survival is very, very poor. As long as they are present early and they are operable, they usually tend to do well. So again, let's not bother about the facts and figures which I have put up. What I just told you is more important. So that concludes my discussion on gallbladder. So in gallbladder, just to summarize everything, the most important thing is you need to know the biliary anatomy. There's no two things about it. Now, apart from knowing the biliary anatomy, we also need to know the physiology of how bile is secreted. Okay. Then you also need to understand, what is the basis by which, the tumors, not the tumors, the polydogal cyst. What is the importance of the anomaly of the junction, the biliopancreatic junction? When there is anomaly, usually there is reflux, and that leads to polydogal cyst. And once you have polydogal cyst, you also run the risk of gallbladder malignancy as well as malignancy of the CVD. Then you have also sclerosing cholangitis, which can cause gallbladder malignancy, and also it can lead to malignancy of the CVD. So all this. Then this apart, we also have this chlorotis sinensis or the liver fluke, which can lead to malignancy of the biliary tract. Then I did talk about some exposure to certain dyes, which can also lead to malignancies. Right. So the other thing is, as far as malignancy is concerned, there are two important malignancies: one that arises from the gallbladder, and another that arises from the CVD. The presentation as far as gallbladder malignancy is concerned, once the patient comes with jaundice, it usually means it's an advanced patient, because from the gallbladder it should have spread into the common bile duct and the common hepatic duct to be able to produce jaundice, right? Whereas in the case of CVD malignancy, jaundice is an early presentation. But in CVD malignancy, as long as pain is not there, it usually means it's an early lesion. Once pain comes, it usually means a late lesion. But we also know that once you have cholangitis, that means infection of the bile in the obstructive system, you can also have pain. So as long as cholangitis is not there, if pain is there in this patient, usually it would mean a late lesion. So in malignancies, if you detect early, the chances of your patient doing well is good. If the detection is late, the prognosis is good. The other important thing, of course, is the gallbladder stones or polylithiasis. Polylithiasis is one of the most surgeons world over deal with, and therefore cholecystectomy is the commonest operation. When we are talking about operation, we also need to know that among the open and laparoscopic cholecystectomy, the laparoscopic cholecystectomy is done more often, and today that is described as the gold standard operation for polylithiasis. As far as polylithiasis is concerned, you need to know that the whole physiology behind development of stones and the types of stones that are there. And you also need to know what are the various presentations of stones in the gallbladder. Most of the polylithiasis are usually, or let me put it the other way, most of the cholecystitis is usually the one associated with stones, but there are few situations where the cholecystitis may not be associated with stones, that is called as acalculous cholecystitis. Otherwise, more than 95% of the polylithiasis are the ones which are the reason for cholecystitis. So apart from the stone formation, you also need to know what are the various modes of presentation. You also need to know the concept of stones in the CVD. The stones in the CVD are two types. The primary variety, where the stones develop in the bile duct, and usually it is associated with infection and worm infestation and other things. Whereas you have the secondary variety in which the stone slips from the gallbladder into the CVD, and there is a stone in the CVD. So the presentation of stones in the CVD is a total different one as compared to stones in the gallbladder. And regarding management of stones in the CVD, there is a whole lot of things that I have discussed, and that is something that you need to remember. So these are the important things you need to know and remember as far as the biliary system is concerned. So in the next class, we'll be talking about pancreas, and first, as it is customary, we'll be talking about the anatomy and the physiology of significance or importance as far as development of some of the diseases in that area is concerned. And then we'll be talking about acute pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis, and also the malignancies that arise from that area. So I hope that when we meet in the next class, although I won't be having the opportunity to ask you questions, but I hope that you would have read a little bit of anatomy and also a little bit of embryology about development of the pancreas. That will make my job easy. Thank you.